Hello, now on BBC One, the news at 9:35 with Michael Burke.
President Gorbachev accepts a breakup of the Soviet Union. The republics, he says, should be free to go their own way. He tells the Soviet parliament there'll be no more hesitation over reform. And inside the Lubyanka, the secret world of the KGB. Good evening. President Gorbachev told the Supreme Soviet, the Union's parliament today, the country had changed since the abortive coup, and so had he. He bowed to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Those republics that didn't want to sign the new Union Treaty, he said, were free to go their own way. He said there would be no more hesitation or compromise over reforms, and that he personally wanted to be a Scandinavian-style social democrat.
The deputies arriving at the Parliament were about to face a public examination of their conduct during the coup. The Supreme Soviet as a whole has been severely criticised for failing to oppose the plotters. And when Mr. Gorbachev came to the podium, he was in serious mood, ready to accept part of the blame for not having removed the hardliners from power well before the coup.
As president, I have to accept a large part of the responsibility for the coup. I have thought over many things during the past few days, and these tragic events have led me to certain conclusions.
Mr. Gorbachev confirmed that the shock of the coup had made him rethink his political priorities and commit himself now to radical reform.
Since I came back from the Crimea, I have been able to look at everything, the past and the present, and to look with new eyes. As long as I remain president, I will allow no hesitation in carrying out reforms. And from now on, there will be no compromises with those who oppose what we are doing.
As the arguments continued over responsibility for the coup, Anatoly Lukyanov, the former Speaker of the Parliament and a long-time comrade of Mr. Gorbachev, bowed to accusations that he was the driving force behind the plotters and resigned, still protesting his innocence.
How could I betray a man to whom I have been connected for over 40 years? I was not the ideologist behind this coup and could not be. My position was made clear at the plenum. I said I would not sign any documents and not participate in this at all.
Mr. Gorbachev seems to have taken to heart the treachery of the communists. This afternoon, far from defending the party, he underlined the shift in his political loyalties by pledging allegiance to the West European ideal of social democracy.
I am a man whose spirit is infused with the ideals of socialism. I am close to the ideals of Willy Brandt and to Swedish-style socialism.
The first fruits of Mr. Gorbachev's born-again radicalism were a promise to open talks on independence with republics which want to leave the Union, and a commitment to hold free presidential elections as soon as possible. Mr. Gorbachev now seemingly realizing that his only chance of winning those elections is to promise the far-reaching reforms that the people are demanding. There was encouraging news for the Soviet leader this afternoon. Boris Yeltsin's vice president, Alexander Rudskoy, confirming that he and Yeltsin would support Mr. Gorbachev in a presidential election.
We must take every opportunity to support Gorbachev so he and Yeltsin, the two leaders, can work together to carry out democratic reform.
And with Boris Yeltsin continuing to enjoy widespread popular support, that endorsement could prove invaluable. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
The archives of the KGB are being seized and examined in the aftermath of the coup, and thousands of cases of torture and internment may now be reopened. The BBC's Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson, has been given unique access to the KGB headquarters, the Lubyanka, one of the most feared places in the country.
Only a few years ago, the Lubyanka was the most frightening building in the Soviet Union. People wouldn't even walk down the same side of the street. Now it's lost its terror to the point where demonstrators can daub slogans on its walls and the workmen have to clean them off. The KGB is trying to show the world it's cleaned up its act too. As a result, it provided an official to guide us round the building. The KGB used to be deeply hostile to foreign journalists, but ever since Mr. Gorbachev revealed he listened to the BBC while he was a prisoner during the coup, the BBC has been much in favor here. The world, as seen from the Lubyanka, has changed in the last week. The statue of the founder of the Soviet secret police, Dzerzhinsky, has been summarily removed from its place in front of the building. A single phone call from the Kremlin now could alter the shape of the entire KGB. Its former boss has already been arrested. The top men who are left are distancing themselves from the coup and everyone concerned in it.
We are officers and we obey orders. But when the criminal group which planned the coup were stopped, there were plenty of cheerful faces in the KGB. As a citizen, I felt light at heart too. But as a member of the KGB staff, I felt depressed because men from the KGB had joined the coup's leaders instead of upholding the law.
On his shelves, the general had a book on the KGB by one of his colleagues who worked secretly for British intelligence, Oleg Gordievsky. I asked if the KGB and the West would continue to work against each other now.
Intelligence must change its function. It must become a way for governments to have confidence in each other. It must control criminal actions, terrorism, which violates the wishes of the individual, drugs, which violate the health of the individual, and smuggling, which violates national interests. Cooperation with other governments to beat these actions is, I think, a good future for the KGB. By exchanging information to defeat these things, intelligence can serve noble ends.
In the past, of course, the KGB and its predecessors served some of the worst ends in human history. The general led the way for us into the office where the heads of Soviet security have worked for 70 years. All the men who used this room in the past were prepared to use violence on a daily basis. One or two were psychopaths. It's from here that the KGB and all its Soviet predecessors have been run. Yagoda and Beria controlled the Great Terror of the 1930s, in which millions died from this room. Philby, Burgess and McLean were controlled from here too. Now it's just becoming a museum piece. That at least is the hope. Outside in the courtyard we could see the prison within a prison, the place where some of the best-known victims of the Soviet state were held, tortured and broken in the past. But the KGB has a different self-image, and we were taken to see the museum which records its successes. Normally only KGB employees are allowed here. At first our minders let us see what we wanted. Then we came to the dirty tricks department, cameras hidden in pens, guns hidden in tape recorders. And finally, we found the part of the museum dedicated to the KGB's penetration of British intelligence. Burgess, Philby, Blunt and McLean were all commemorated here, though if there was a fifth man, he wasn't on show. By now, though, our minders didn't want to let us film any more. The KGB still guards some secrets. John Simpson, BBC News, Moscow.
The Baltic Republic of Lithuania moved one step closer to independence today, taking control of its own border with Poland. There are still some Soviet officials on the border, but the Lithuanians say crossings can be run jointly until their relations with the Soviet government are formalized.
Up to now, it's taken on average 3 days to cross the border between Lithuania and Poland. Bureaucracy, the scarcity of crossing points, rampant smuggling and sheer sloth combined to give travellers a rotten time. But those at the back of this queue 3 days ago expected to deal with Soviet border guards checking visas in Russian. By the time they got to the front of the queue this morning, they found Lithuanians instead, in a temporary, somewhat undignified office, acquired after a 100-mile midnight dash to the border. The Lithuanian consular officials from Vilnius had been wielding their newly acquired rubber stamps since dawn. Not only visas, but Lithuanian passports as well, something else that's had to be hurriedly produced in the rush towards independence. These swift changes have left the Soviet border guard more than slightly bewildered. So far today, they've been amiably cooperating with the new regime, but they are surplus to requirement, and they admit rather lamely that they're waiting for further orders. But even with Lithuanians in control, old habits die hard. Nitpicking, form-filling, minute inspection at customs. It will change for the better, say the Lithuanians, but before the borders come down, as the West wants, they have to go up as a symbol of independence. Kate Adey, BBC News, Lazdier on the Lithuanian border.
The pace of change has continued throughout the Soviet Union, almost without check. In Moscow, the Vice President of the Russian Republic wants a Russian veto on the Soviet Union's use of nuclear weapons. Boris Yeltsin's office said Russian ministers had been temporarily appointed to 8 top posts in the Soviet government. The Georgian Supreme Soviet has been in emergency session. It's passed a resolution banning the Communist Party in Georgia. The Ukraine has suspended all activities of its Communist Party pending an inquiry. Political leaders throughout the world have been showing their willingness to re-establish diplomatic ties with the Soviet Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. But President Bush has said the United States is not yet quite ready, although such links were now very, very close.
We're moving very fast, and I feel very comfortable with what other countries are doing. I think we've already stated our conviction that not only will they be free, but they'll be independent. And I'd just like to see a little bit more, a few more cards on the table before we take another step.
Well, a few minutes ago, I asked Martin Sixsmith in Moscow just how much President Gorbachev's position had changed since the coup.
Well, he seems to have undergone something of a conversion on the road from the Crimea. Not only did we have this promise of free elections for the presidency and the promise to open negotiations on independence with those republics wanting to leave the Union, we also had the most radical pledges of market economic reform in the Soviet Union that we've ever heard from Mr. Gorbachev. He was talking about removing all obstacles to economic enterprise, to decentralizing economic decision-making to the republics, and also a commitment to land reform. These are all reforms which he had opposed in the past, and he now seems to support.
Is he shifting position to save his political neck? And if so, will it work?
Well, he clearly knows that this is the only programme which will keep him afloat politically. You could say, on the other hand, that he's now pushing ahead with reforms that he always wanted to enact, but was prevented from doing so by the Conservatives in the past. Ironically, though, the very reforms that he is now promoting could eventually spell his downfall, because he could easily lose the free elections that he's been talking about. And if the republics do leave the Soviet Union, then he'd be left with nothing to rule. He'd be a czar without a kingdom.
But would you see him as a Swedish social democratic czar?
Well, I think that's the most interesting thing to emerge today, this public commitment to the ideal of Swedish-style socialism. That is an indication of the move away from the old communist ideals that he used to support. But I think in the end he could end up more like a British monarch than a Swedish Prime Minister, with nominal powers, but in fact with no power at all.
Other news now. Fighting has now broken out on 2 fronts in the Yugoslav Republic of Croatia. Vukovar and Vinkovci, near the border with Serbia, have come under heavy fire from Federal Army tanks and aircraft, and there have been battles at Sinji, Kijevo and Vrlika, close to the Adriatic resort of Split.
As jets of the Yugoslav Air Force stepped up their attacks on Croatian targets today, even hospital buildings came into the firing line. For the first time since the Second World War, people in eastern Croatia took to air raid shelters as the fighting intensified. The town of Vinkovci is now reported to be cut off by the Yugoslav army. Vukovar was also strafed and bombed as infantry units and columns of armoured vehicles advanced on the relatively lightly armed Croatian forces. The loss of the town to the Federal Army would be a major setback for the breakaway republic. The casualties are mounting. 3 people are said to have died when a tank crushed this car. The spreading conflict has also claimed casualties in Sinja. Estimates of the numbers killed so far range from 250 to 500. But with political negotiations still deadlocked, there appears to be nothing to prevent the conflict from continuing.
The United Nations Secretary-General, Mr. Pérez de Cuéllar, says there are signs of progress in the Middle East hostage crisis. He plans to meet an Iranian envoy tomorrow. Earlier, Mr. Pérez de Cuéllar was briefed by his special representative, Gian Domenico Pico, who visited Israel last week. The Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Veliati held talks today with Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, groups believed to be holding the Western hostages. Germany has asked Moscow to extradite the former East German communist leader Erich Honecker. He fled to the Soviet Union 6 months ago. He's accused of issuing shoot-to-kill orders against East Germans who tried to flee to the West. A man has died in hospital after being stabbed last night at the end of the first day of the Notting Hill Carnival. Despite the death, the carnival has had its lowest crime rate ever. The organisers say more than 1 million people went to it.
Temperatures in the 80s brought huge crowds to Notting Hill this afternoon for the climax of Europe's biggest street festival. 26 bands and thousands of dancers joined the parade in costumes which had been months in the making. They'd come from as far afield as Colombia and Brazil. At times they could hardly move through crowds the police put at 600,000, the carnival organisers at over 1 million. As in recent years, the carnival has been relatively trouble-free, with less than 100 arrests. But there's been one serious crime. Last night, 2 groups leaving the carnival clashed on the fringes of Notting Hill. A 38-year-old man was stabbed with what police described as a combat knife. He died 3 hours later in hospital. This evening, hours after the music was supposed to be turned off, thousands are still reluctant to go home. The police, with 1,500 officers on patrol, are hopeful there'll be no further problems.